Hey, everybody. So, significant news today, and not just today, but you could see the buildup over the past couple days. This really began in earnest when a somewhat suspicious Politico report came out, which revealed that Bernie Sanders volunteers in Iowa had allegedly been circulating a script for how canvassers should deal with voters who might prefer another candidate. So there was a recommended script for what Bernie volunteers should do if they encounter a supporter of Biden, Warren, or Pete. And this is extremely commonplace. Now, we don't know the exact provenance of this script. There's some dispute and confusion over whether it came from an actual staffer or a volunteer. Either way, when you have a operation as large as the Bernie campaign is, he's got an incredible amount of money, which means he can hire a lot of staff. So even if it was a lower level staffer, I mean, who cares, right? And even if you look at the script in terms of what was recommended that the canvassers say to voters they encounter, it was incredibly mild and it was pretty much accurate. What it said was that if you come across a Warren supporter, you should remind the individual that Warren overperforms or her core base consists of people who are relatively affluent within the Democratic Party coalition, which is just objectively true if you look at the polling data. Warren has always been boosted by the support that she garners among the highly educated and affluent elements of the Democratic Party electorate. So there's nothing wrong with pointing that out. And the reason that it was pointed out in the script was because that, according to the Bernie campaign, or at least through the people who were responsible for creating the script, indicates that Warren would have difficulty putting together the coalition necessary to defeat Trump in the general election. When what the Bernie campaign argument is that you need a core base of support that is fundamentally of the working class. And Bernie polls better by a lot than Warren among non-college educated voters and voters who have a lesser income. So, just assuming that script was accurate, which it may not have been. Right. So assuming that script was actually a real product of the Bernie campaign, not a huge deal, incredibly mild. There are tons of worse things that could conceivably be said about Warren, which were not anywhere in that script. But Warren decided to make a stink about it, and at a press avail, as they're called, there's so many ridiculous little journalistic lingo terms for basically just standing there and putting a microphone in front of a politician. Avail, gaggle, whatever. So Warren was at one of these things, and she said how disappointed she was that the Bernie campaign had decided to trash her. She used the word trash. And if that's trashing you're getting, that's pretty mild. I mean, does anybody remember the 2016 Republican primary? By this point, January 2016, right? Donald Trump had compared Ben Carson to a child molester and was already ranting about how Trump was an ineligible Canadian who could not even be legally permitted to run for the presidency. And you can name a million other crazy attacks, usually around Trump from that primary, and even at times the Bernie Hillary contest got a little heated. So if Warren is not describing this as being trashed, a low level staffer or even a volunteer putting out a polite script saying this is what you should do if you encounter a Warren supporter, then I mean, you got to be incredibly thin-skinned. So for her to react to it in that way seemed like it was calculated. At times, when potential criticisms related to Bernie are brought up to her, she's kind of brushed it off and said, "Look, on Bernie's side, and we just got to plug ahead and all that." But she changed course yesterday and said that she was disappointed that she was trashed. And then, sure enough, shortly thereafter, a fundraising email from Warren's campaign went out bemoaning this incident and said, "Hey, Bernie's after us. Now you got to give us money." And then, sure enough, hours later comes the bombshell. Now, bombshell is such a laughably overused word. I'm kind of using it semi-ironically, but in terms of the Bernie Warren dynamic, it is a bombshell because it's a massive escalation in the conflict between them, uh, far beyond anything that's occurred before. CNN was told, apparently, by sources who were not physically present in the room, but were allegedly told directly by presumably Warren, that when Bernie and Warren met in December of 2018 in Warren's apartment in Washington, D.C., Bernie told her that a woman could not win the presidency. Now, does that seem like something that is consistent with everything we know about Bernie Sanders? Do you really think he has a genuine belief that a woman could never win the presidency? Doubtful. If I had to put myself in that situation, what I would think he probably said is that a woman would face unique perils or unique obstacles as a result of Trump's tactics, which, according to Bernie and Warren and other Democrats who say this all the time, uh, leverages misogyny to diminish female candidates. So if Bernie said something to that effect, I wouldn't be surprised, but it also wouldn't be this blanket statement that a woman could never win the presidency, which is ridiculous. And Bernie put out a blistering response to this, basically lambasting it as ridiculous and that he didn't say that. But the point is that now it's out there. If you go and look at the CNN headline today, all you really need sometimes is a headline to really make inroads in public consciousness. So look at what the headline said. I don't know if you can see this on my phone, and I know I shouldn't just lift up my phone and put it there. Oh yeah, so it's going to be there. Whatever. It's inverted. It says Bernie Sanders told Warren a woman can't win, sources say. That's the blaring CNN headline. And I actually just flipped on CNN today just to watch some of the coverage. And of course, it's being credulously reported. They will mention that Bernie disputes it, but just the allegation itself is obviously intended to be harmful to Bernie because going back years, there's been this undercurrent of disdain for Bernie, that he somehow doesn't respect women, or that he has these army of vicious bros who are attacking people online. There hasn't been as much of the Bernie bro attack this cycle, but I wouldn't, in part because Bernie now has a lot more institutional leverage within the Democratic Party, so it's harder to just cast his supporters as these, freakish trolls or whatever. But this plays on that line of attack, and Warren referenced it when she said that we can't allow for factionalism. That was the word she used, to erupt like it did in 2016. So my immediate reaction to that, Warren, bemoaning the potentiality of factionalism, was to say, okay, what about the factions of the Democratic Party, of which there were many, the vast, vast, vast majority, which decided well ahead of time, well before any votes were cast in the 2016 primaries, that the field should be cleared for Hillary. Hillary was entitled to the Democratic nomination that year, and the only people who bristled at that notion were Bernie, who at the time was considered just a eccentric oddball, and like 3 or 4 other guys who nobody remembers the name of, but I do because I'm an insufferable nerd on these kinds of things. Martin O'Malley, Jim Webb, Lawrence Lessig. So those were the only people who decided to challenge Hillary in 2016. And the fact that the field this year was so enormous shows you that there was like a pent up energy there that had been suppressed in 2015 because factions of the party, there's that word, factions, decided to basically preempt the entire nominating process and hand it over to Hillary. So when they talk about factionalism, those factions always seem to go ignored. Why is that? Well, it's because it's factionalism for me, but not for thee. So even people had Warren had people encouraging her to run. There was a grassroots movement that I actually reported on at the time. That was like a pro Warren, almost pressure group to try to entice her to get into the 2016 primary. And the lore goes that one of the reasons that Bernie even ran was because Warren decided not to run, and he felt that there had to be another voice in the primary contest. Um, so today you have this bombshell, pseudo bombshell, whatever, dropped, saying that, which basically is just intended to convey or signal that Bernie has a problem with women, right? That's the connotation of the story that was evidently sat on for over a year by Warren while they were playing nice with Bernie and had the so-called pact. Now, pacts always break down uh, over the course of an electoral season, especially when the candidates end up in contention, right? So there was a thought to be a pact between Ted Cruz and Trump in 2016, and by the end of it, you had Trump trashing Ted Cruz's wife. You had Trump leading auditoriums full of roaring supporters in a chant of "Line Ted." You had the whole JFK thing where Trump insinuated that Cruz's father was involved in the JFK assassination, and you had Ted Cruz calling Trump a sniveling coward and a pathological liar. So the pact didn't hold, but of course now they're back on good terms because that's just how politics works. When you're on the cusp of acquiring power, you're not going to honor a pact. And so this story on CNN, I mean, in addition to the bigger political implications, it also is the worst kind of just gossip mongering, click hungry, ratings hungry campaign journalism, right? Where they have these anonymous sources who obviously sought out the reporter. I would be astonished if the reporter who quote unquote broke this did it through shoe leather investigative reporting. No, it was just a bunch of people who said, okay, now's the time to put something out there. Let's go to our favored CNN journalist, and she'll put it out on our behalf, more or less. And it doesn't interrogate the motives of these sources because they're anonymous. It doesn't put it into a proper context. It just sort of credulously parrots whatever these people are saying. And it amounts to a major escalation in the campaign, because if you've been following these campaigns long enough, when candidates really go hard at one another, what tends to have happened, at least in recent history, this could be totally different this time, but famously, for example, Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt in the 2004 Democratic primary, which is actually a relatively close analog to this primary, because it was in the context of an incumbent Republican president, with even a big foreign policy issue breaking out. The Iraq War was obviously on a much bigger scale than this latest Iran flare-up, but still, George W. Bush, widely loathed in the Democratic Party, and people were desperate to find a nominee who could beat him. And what happened was Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt went ruthlessly at one another, and they both essentially collapsed. And the guy who kind of stood above the fray, John Kerry, and even to an extent John Edwards, rose up, and John Kerry ended up winning the Iowa caucus by a considerable margin and glided to the nomination from there. So, obviously we don't have enough of a big enough sample size to say that what happened in 2004 can happen here. Much different circumstances, etc. But there is a possibility that the two quote unquote leading progressive candidates going at one another like this could harm them both and advantage even Biden, for example. I saw Faiz Shakir. I hope I got that right. Hold on a second. I know it's Faiz. Yeah, Faiz Shakir. The Bernie campaign manager, who's been around progressive media for a long time. I've known of him for years. He responded to this today and basically called it a lie. And I think if you're calling it a lie, if you're saying that this allegation is a lie. And the source of the lie is Elizabeth Warren herself, which, I mean, Occam's razor, people, who else could have greenlit this story other than Warren herself, given what had just happened the previous day, given the tack that they're apparently taking? That seems plausible. We don't know with 100% certainty, but let's say that it was Warren who, was spreading these rumors and greenlit whoever, staff or somebody with plausible deniability, to go to CNN and put this out there. And what's essentially happening is that the Bernie campaign is accusing Warren of being a liar. So that's pretty rough. So what are some potential scenarios that can happen as a result of this? Well, I mean, if you want to have the most cynical conspiratorial explanation, it could be that Warren is basically kamikazing Bernie, right? Because Bernie does need to gather a bit more support, I would say, among people who are outside his core constituency, who are already fervently behind him. Right? And in the closing days of the Iowa caucus campaign, 3 weeks to go, people are going to be making up their minds. Right? So you could imagine a progressive leaning, let's say, middle-aged woman in Iowa who supported Hillary, maybe didn't like Bernie in 2016, but has come around to him somewhat, would be willing to entertain voting for Bernie if she believed that Bernie would be the best nominee against Trump. But they're still waiting to make up their mind, and all of a sudden they get this headline, flashed across their TV and social media feeds. What? Bernie doesn't think a woman could win? Oh, that reminds me of why he allegedly didn't support Hillary fulsomely enough, even though he did, what was it, dozens of campaign events for Hillary, and much to the chagrin of actually a vocal faction of his supporters. But that's the type of voter who could be put off by this, right? And are they now going to support Warren? I guess it's possible, but it could also be the case that somebody who just floats above the fray, like a Biden, could be the one who emerges. There was a poll from Iowa from Monmouth, which not an infallible polling entity by any stretch, but one that's considered relatively reputable, that had Biden in the lead today in Iowa. In fairness, Bernie was in the lead in the gold standard poll a couple days ago from the Des Moines Register. But the margin of error here is kind of hazy. It's definitely a close race in Iowa. And if you have a late breaking controversy meant to diminish Bernie, hey, it could work. And if Biden wins the Iowa caucus, man, it's going to be tough to beat Biden, because Iowa was never thought to be his strongest state. It's actually thought to be maybe one of his weaker states.